Okay, so I want to welcome Lindsay Chichester. She used to be my colleague at the University of Nevada, Reno, and I am so excited, one, to get on her busy schedule, but I love this topic of bees. It's what makes us go round, or as she said, the backbone of food and agriculture. And so, Lindsay, we did a little bio on the agenda, but I'll let Lindsay introduce herself as well. Thank you so much for joining us, Lindsay.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me, Vicky. And anytime I can talk about bees and geek out there, that's always a fun time. So as we were kind of talking about what to share with you, uh, it's just the backbone of agriculture. So let me switch over to my presentation here. All right. Can everybody see that all right? Okay, I'm
Can
seeing
you
nodding.
that?
All
Yeah,
right.
perfect.
Great. So, as Vicky said, my name is Lindsay Chichester. I just took on a new role here in Nevada. I am transitioning into our Nevada 4-H program leader space and out of my extension educator at the county level. So it's kind of a chaotic time, but it'll be fun, lots of opportunities. So if you've seen me before or heard me talk before, I'm an animal and meat scientist by training, and I actually became a beekeeper because when I moved into my county role, everybody indicated that they just, whoops, I was trying to, now I'm going nuts. All right. Indicated that they just wanted more information on bees and pollinators in general in my county. So I took a deep dive into it and learned everything I could in the fall of 2019, early 2020, and was ready to go. And then, of course, as we know, COVID shut everything down, and I decided I'm about as ready as I'm ever going to be. So became a beekeeper and started my 5th year now. All of my experience is based out of the Northern Nevada area. Southern Nevada is a little different because we do have some Africanized bees down there that we do not have up here in the north yet. So I usually manage anywhere between 5 and 8 hives, and that's plenty in addition to everything else I do. Some days it's too many, but it's quite a bit of fun. And then one of the things I did as a result of starting this to get back to my county needs assessment was started just a bee and pollinator club for the area. So we meet monthly and have different meetings, and other club members have started hosting. And then we also have a 4-H club now that also meets, and we're getting ready to kick off that adventure with our youth next month. So it should be pretty exciting. So let's talk a little bit about bees and pollinators in general. And I'm sure for some of you, this is stuff you already knew, but I find that it's always just a good refresher anyway. The power of pollinators. So more than 70% of the crops that we rely on for food need pollinators because of either the fruit that they need to put on, seeds, anything like that for what we eat, but also our livestock. So this usually equates to about 1 in every 3 bites of food exists because of pollinators. And it's some of the things that we all enjoy most: fruits, vegetables, chocolate, coffee, even a lot of our nuts and spices. Almonds is what we usually think of as well, just because of the big pollination efforts on the West Coast. Pollinators are part of the whole food web. And what that means is we rely on pollinators to not only pollinate fruit and vegetables and all the things that they do, but then other things also rely on pollinators. So, we have other insects that eat some of our pollinators, the birds, and then other species that eat that. So the whole food chain and food web becomes important, and pollinators are definitely an important part of that. So just as we think about habitat for pollinators and what that can look like, I always encourage people, as you think about, whether it's in your home landscaping or you're looking at planting on an acreage, the same concepts still apply. So anything that's blooms from early spring to late fall. I know for most people, dandelions is some of that first bloom in the spring, which is a great source for pollen and nectar for our pollinators, but then things that go through the fall. And the problem becomes in those shoulder seasons where nothing's blooming. And so it's real hard for them to get enough to eat during those times. I'm going to talk about honeybees, but I just want to mention also that our native bees are also very important. And there's been a big dialogue within those communities about, are we raising too many managed or honeybees at the sake of native bees? And I'll get into that a little bit more, but it's important to think about habitats that support all of the flying insects and bees. And then finally, just some of the ecological services are valued at about 200 billion each year. And that includes the pollination services in addition to the food. And then it just generates to more profitable yields on our working agriculture lands. All right, I saw a couple comments. Let me just check those. Okay, thanks for sharing some links in the chat there.
Linz, I'll keep track of those. I was going to wait till the end with some of those comments.
Oh, okay, perfect. So whenever I work with people, I always ask who pollinates, and I'm kind of giving it to you here, but the kids always have a good time with this, and it varies drastically. But of course, our honeybees, all the butterflies, some wasps, moths, beetles, flies, hummingbirds, bats. A lot of things are wind pollinated, especially in our Midwest region where there's a lot of cropping. Us, wildlife. So there's a lot of things that pollinate, and some of them are more intentional about it. Others are more accidental. Like us, sometimes we don't always mean to pollinate and it just happens. But why does bee pollination matter? So at the end of the day, bees are probably the most important group of pollinators. And they're a little bit different than some of the others because they and some wasps, I know sometimes wasp can be that 4-letter word that we don't like, but wasps are considered pollinators as well. But they purposely will bring pollen back to the hive or their nest to feed their offspring. So we don't always see that in the pollinators, except in honeybees. And when honeybees are out pollinating, they have what's called flower constancy or flower fidelity, meaning that they will visit one particular plant species on a foraging trip. So they'll go to a bunch of flowers that all look the same. And if you want to get really deep down in the rabbit hole, combinations of 3 are what a lot of horticulture people recommend. So if you're going to plant 3 globe mallows in your yard, or globe mallows in your yard, you would plant 3 because the bees have an easier time foraging on that specific thing in one trip. And they look for flowers that look the same. It can be a little bit hard for them when they're going different flower, different flower, different flower. And just in one single trip, the female bee, the worker bee, can visit hundreds of different flowers, transferring pollen the entire way. So if you've ever watched bees, you see that where they're quickly there. Sometimes they'll see that maybe someone was there before them and took the nectar and most of the pollen, so they don't really stop. They just kind of hover and keep going. So they're pretty efficient in how they do this. So we see a little bit different in our other pollinators. The butterflies, moths, wasps tend to feed more on the nectar, the sugar water that the plant provides just for the energy. That's their carb source. Beetles sometimes will just feed on the flower itself. So they kind of get in there and will munch on some pieces of the flower, and they don't necessarily collect pollen. So again, this goes back to why the honeybees and some wasps are so important for pollination. So besides the honeybees, which is the most well-known and the one that we hear of the most, they are just one small fraction of all bee species. Worldwide, there's about 20,000 different species of bees, and about 3,600 of those are native to the US and Canada alone. So in North America, we've got quite a few bee species here. Most of them are actually solitary, which means they just prefer to live their lives alone. And the female builds her own nest, lays her egg, gathers all the food that she needs for her egg, and she does it without the help of others. Of course, honeybees are different. they live in a colony and have thousands of sisters helping contribute to that. So solitary bees, anytime we work with kids, it's always interesting because everybody has a sting story and nobody wants to ever get stung. And usually there's some hand flailing going on. But solitary bees usually aren't aggressive because it's just them. So just their goal of, they have to get food, they have to lay the eggs. It's up to them to ensure that that generation continues. They aren't likely to sting people, and a lot of them are stingless. So there's a lot of misconceptions just around the behavior and anatomy of insects as well. So native bees, just like honeybees, usually do seek out the nectar and pollen to feed their young. They transfer the pollen, which is ultimately the goal, is they're trying to pollinate any of the plants for seed and fruit. That's what has to happen in order for the fruit to be reproduce. In some instances, native bees are actually better at pollination than our honeybees, and you can see the example of this one in this photo here, how hairy it is, especially on its legs, and then that front segment of the body, the thorax, and the underside of its belly. So native bees tend to have more hair, which they're able to collect more pollen from, versus the honeybee, which usually puts the pollen on its hind legs. So the pollen becomes a little bit different in a carry method because these native bees, the pollen is loose and more granular versus the honeybees who kind of stick it all together in a ball using some nectar. And then in a little bit, I'll show you some of the crops and just where our honeybees versus native pollinators actually do better. So some of the native pollinators are actually better for some crops than our honeybees are. So it's important. There's been a big conversation about honeybees versus native bees, and are we giving too much attention to one and forsaking the health of the other? And at the end of the day, both of them need, they're both important. They both need everyone's help to survive because they all have a role to play. Honeybees like flowers that have the shallow centers, kind of a flat petal, so they can access things more easily. And then your native bees do have more specific preferences. So the leaf cutter bee, which if you've ever seen one of your leaves in your garden or out in the wild that kind of has like a little half moon shape cut out of it, that's usually the leaf cutter. They'll munch out that piece and use it in their nest when they lay their eggs. But they also pollinate alfalfa, canola, cranberries, onions, peas, blueberries. So a lot of our agriculture crops. Bumblebees really like some of our more floriculture type flowers, larkspur, iris, columbine. But then they do dabble in some of our our vegetable stuff as well. And then here I have long-throated flowers. So as flowers, the honeybees like the flat ones, bumblebees and other species can get a longer proboscis, their tongue, to get down into those flowers to access that nectar. So flower petal design, flower design in general changes based on your species. The USDA indicates that pollination services from native pollinators is valued at about $3.4 billion, and honeybees value of pollination services is at 15 billion. So honeybees, just overall have a larger value attached to those pollination services for the foods that we consume and agriculture services, but those native bees certainly play a role too. Honeybees responsible for pollinating about 80% of flowering plants and about 130 different types of fruits and vegetables. I talked about this earlier, but a good reminder of the significance of our pollinators. So let's look at a little bit what this looks like in agriculture specifically. This is from a SARE publication called Managing Alternative Pollinators. And it just shows some of the routes that the migratory beekeepers, the commercial beekeepers do around the country. And you can see if we start in California, the West Coast, we've got almonds It goes further up, does apples, blueberries, and then they head over up north to Montana, the Dakotas, Minnesota for all the canola, sunflowers. Those bees might go south to Texas. So you can see there's a lot of movement. It's very similar to other livestock species across the country for these pollination services. Down to Florida for citrus, back up to Maine, blueberries. So there's a lot of travel happening for the bees, but then there's also some states that might surprise you. The ones in yellow are major honey producing states. So I always think that's interesting. I think North Dakota, last time I checked, was actually leading honey production in our country. Also in this publication, and I've given you the link for this at the end as well, if you want to dig further into it, is the type of bees that are primarily responsible for some of the agriculture crops. So they just did it into 4 major kinds: the honeybee, bumblebee, leafcutters, and mason bees. And I won't go through all of these. You can see that, again, the honeybees are a primary pollinator for a lot of our agricultural food products. But if you start noticing, let me get it to another slide. If we're going to be in fruit production, or if that's something you're interested in, it's important to have multiple options for the pollinators, because we start seeing in some of our peaches, pears, plums, some of those stone fruits, that we have multiple pollinators that help with that pollination. So just some management things to consider if this is of interest, and as we see some of those climatic changes and different warming, what that means for our pollinators and what they prefer or really do well in pollinating. And finally, I just put red clover here because I think a lot of people have this in agriculture pastures. I know we have it here in northern Nevada. That honeybees aren't the primary pollinator for some of our clovers. Bumblebees are there. White clover's here too, which is a great one for honeybees. But even as we think about pasture settings, who can benefit from what we're putting in our pastures? So some considerations for what this looks like in agriculture, as we think about what we potentially can control. Obviously, we may not have a lot of influence on what happens in the grand scheme of global pollination and what that means for our food. But locally, as we are, myself work in agriculture, we work with a lot of people who are putting in cover crops, and cover crops are a great place to think about where we can make some real benefits and help our pollinators, mostly from the standpoint of, because once the honeybees leave their cash crop, or the crop that they're getting paid to pollinate, then they need a place to rest. And sometimes when they come off of the pollination season, they're hungry. They'll bring them to small communities to hang out for a couple months until they move them again to hit another season. And cover crops are a great way to provide not only forage to those honeybees, but also nest habitat space. So, the ones that dwell in the ground or in debris that we find, cover crops are really great for a lot of our pollinators in that aspect. So of course, with everything, there's a caveat, and cover crops is just finding one that works for in your area, the bloom times that are compatible, working around your other crops that might be there. And then, as I mentioned earlier, just having things that try to bloom as early in the season and as late in the season as possible to give that longer flower period. And then letting things actually go to seed, because that's what we see a lot is, people plant alfalfa or hay crops. And then, of course, as soon as it's blooming, it's being cut for the nutritional value. But then our pollinators lose that as a food source as well. So just being able to let things go to seed and go to bloom is important in these situations. And then, of course, the avoiding insecticides or pesticides where possible, not only because of drift, but also because it does impact the pollinators and can have a detrimental impact on them too.
Okay, so this is a great point to point out the chat. Aaron Riley, who is with NIFA USDA, said there's an Albuquerque company that develops pesticide that won't harm bees. So if you want to pass that information to any of your producers, that link is in the chat and we'll send it out as well.
Oh, great. Yeah, that is good to know, because I know sometimes we need to do things and under management decisions that aren't always favorable for pollinators. And then of course, like with everything, use this as a tool in the toolbox in the integrated pest management world when you're combining management practices to have the most ideal aspect. But, at the end of the day, minimizing tillage, some of these good production practices that we know of, intercropping, different sources of cover crops and plants together, limiting use of insecticides, pesticides. So a lot of these are just things that we know of and things to continue to think about as we look at what agriculture looks like on the pollinator side. And then of course there's buffer or pollinator strips. So this is being a little more intentional of where we're planting things. You can see in that top picture, it looks like maybe they're growing wheat somewhere, not in the mountain countries, but they've got sunflowers and lots of other flowers there. And this is a good place where you're probably going to have some sort of drainage, water running through. Maybe the ground is a little tougher and you don't want equipment running over it. So these are good places to put these pollinator strips or buffer strips along roadways. That bottom picture has different herbs in there, flowers, and these are good just for, dust control. Maybe it's also a sacrifice area. So if you're planting your crop that you necessarily don't want the insects to get to, you plant some other things that they will be attracted to and make them come over to that space. And then just keep in mind this doesn't always just help pollinators, but our wildlife as well. So, if you are pheasants or quail, anything like that, that requires some of these habitat and forage spaces too, this is a good thing to think about as well. And finally, windbreaks and shelter belts. These are, of course, just linear plantings of trees and shrubs that provide shade, windbreak protection, help with winds, snow blowing, whatever it is in your area that these help with. These are opportunities to consider your pollinators and wildlife again. So they just help things look pretty. They're functional as well. Maybe they have another space for wood and other non-timber products, but they also help control pests. So, if you're supporting bird habitat, maybe they're taking care of rodent problems. So there's a lot of things that start to become beneficial at multiple levels. And it kind of goes back to that whole food web concept that we talked about, is if you're helping one, you begin to help another species. And then, for me, I always think the so what kind of here is soil health. When bees visit flowers and they spread the pollen and nectar around, they help that plant improve soil microbial activity and nutrient cycling, makes the soil healthier, more fertile. So there's a lot of benefits of, insects on healthy plants, healthy soil, and healthy food. And so obviously plants also help with litter, roots, and keeping land where it needs to be for erosion control. And I thought this was a pretty good graphic, just kind of reminding us all of that from, what's above ground is also drastically impacting what's below ground and the things we can't see, but how the whole thing ties together and works together and how we can help manage that. So just kind of as a recap, that bees and pollinators are the backbone of agriculture. Without them, eventually we would all cease to exist. The food that we eat wouldn't be able to have anything to eat. So supporting the pollinators is a win-win. We can provide them forage and nesting material, but then they also increase the production of what we're trying to grow and help improve our soil. So it's a pretty good relationship there. And then I just put some resources in here that I think are pretty helpful if you want to dig deeper into this. And there's lots more besides this. These are just the big ones that I thought would be good. And that's all I've got.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute. Awesome. Okay, what questions do we have for Lindsay? Maureen?
Yeah, so Lindsay, that was great. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you.
I hail from one of those wonderful honey producing states in Montana. So I encourage everybody to eat more Montana honey. It's fabulous. What do you recommend for folks who are just trying to help support the pollinator population, maybe not necessarily cultivate bees, but help support it on their own property? What are the most effective things that we could be doing?
Sure. So some of the best things that you can do is, again, just providing that forage of things that bloom early in the season through as late in the season as possible. And make sure the things you're putting out are actually some of the native plants as well, because we always want to plant some of the showy ones and they don't do well in our climates. And, then it becomes more of an annual rather than a perennial planting. But that is always helpful. Providing a water source. So oftentimes all of our pollinators need something to drink, and it can just be, a pan with some rocks in it. They just need something to stand on so they don't drown. And then supporting your local beekeepers and people who are doing this. Sometimes we see the honey in the grocery store and it's much cheaper than what we saw at the farmer's market, but that's usually not always real honey. Somehow it's been adulterated.
Yeah.
And if it never crystallizes, that's a good sign it's probably not real honey. It's very natural for honey to crystallize. It's part of the change in the sucrose, glucose, and fructose. It doesn't mean it's gone bad. It just means that you'll need to gently reheat it, but it's just a natural thing. So those would kind of be my 3 tips.
What does
Excellent.
gently reheat mean? Not the microwave?
Not in the microwave, a pan of of hot water on your stove. Don't
Okay.
let it come get above boiling, because then it destroys all the good things that we like honey for.
Okay, I gotta do that. My next question is there any truth to if you get the native, like the local honey, that'll help with your allergies?
Yes and no. Well, the research would say no, because they haven't been able to scientifically prove it. Because most people are allergic to trees, grasses, pollens, things that bees don't necessarily forage on.
Oh yeah.
But there is some truth in, you're still consuming a product from your local area that has pollen in it. So that's usually why most people see some sort of benefit from consuming local honey. Plus, honey is also just really good for you. It's got, it soothes your throat, helps with some of the mucus stuff. So as a food item, it's good for you, but it still is mixed on whether the allergies are truly a benefit. But the more local you can find, the better for sure.
Are we seeing any effects of climate on the bee population right now, or is it mostly just human destroying?
Yes. So I mentioned Africanized bees. As our climate continues to warm, Africanized used to just be in the southern part of the United States. It is coming further north, which Africanized bees are very aggressive. They're a whole different type of bee to manage. So we're starting to see more of that. And then as things get hotter and drier, we just start losing forage for them. So they just run out of things to potentially eat. And, we just don't have enough for them to eat. And then they starve. And when hungry bees are angry bees, nobody likes that either. So.
Yeah. Definitely. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, are yellow jackets pollinators?
That's what I was wondering.
They can be. They're more accidental because they usually go after
meat. They go after meat.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So they're the ones, meat bees get a bad rep because people call them meat bees when they're actually the wasps and yellow jackets that bother us at our backyard barbecues. So I always tell people, if you can cut off a piece of whatever you're eating and lure them away at the other end of your yard. That's a good way
Oh.
because they'll go down there and hopefully eat on your steak or whatever and leave you alone to have the rest of your barbecue. But yeah, they'll go after more protein. And ultimately that's what everything is looking for, is the protein. And the bees do that as well with the pollen that they eat. Bears go after bees not because of the honey, but because of the protein in the beehives as the bees. So everybody's trying to get some protein for survival, and including the wasps.
So Disney is leading us astray.
I know Winnie Pooh is a lie. I mean, I'm sure he liked it, but
and yeah, Rebecca, I was thinking when she said put your steak at the end of the yard, Rebecca said make a sacrifice to the meat bees. It's an expensive
Don't give him
bee
the whole
right
thing.
there. Exactly.
Just give him a bite. Yeah.
So Rebecca's from North Dakota, so she's our queen of bees up there.
All right. Yeah.
So, is there trade-offs between keeping the native bees versus the honeybees happy, and how do you balance that?
I think it's just, honeybees are completely different because we manage them. We're directly involved in a lot of their life. And native bees are a little bit less hands-off. If you provide the forage for them and a habitat, that's important. And other than that, they pretty much do their own thing. We don't get into their hives or anything like that. And yeah, flower beds are stocked, providing, I'm sure everybody has seen those habitats where you've got the different size canes from something that grew in your yard, or the bricks that have the holes, pine cones, whatever, just giving them spaces to do their thing where they go in, lay those eggs, give their eggs some food and leave. So it's always, I think it's important to support all of them in the capacities we can, and never put yourself into debt trying to landscape your whole yard for them. I always tell people, bite off what you can chew this year, and maybe it's 3 new plants, and next year you do 3 new plants again, and just make it manageable, because otherwise it just becomes overwhelming.
That's easy for you to say. We only have 3 months growing season up here. So we all go nuts when we get to runnings and start planting our plants and our herb gardens.
Right.
I just did mine. It was a whole thing. I split the cost on 2 cards, so Marty only thinks that he only spent 100 and some. We go crazy, but it's a good thing.
Yeah.
So
the struggle's real. And that's why, we often get people calling about, why are there honeybees on my hummingbird feeder? Because they're just looking for something to eat. Your hummingbird feeder has sugar water, and that's what the honeybees are after as well. So, oftentimes they all compete for the same resources.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right.
Yep.
Anyone else? I heard someone. No?
That was excellent, Lindsay. Will you send your slides to Vicki so we can post those as well? And would you put your contact in the chat box as well as, I know it's on the slides, but it'd be great if you put it in the chat.
And Lindsay, we do have a question in the chat, and it's from Marjorie. Hi, Marjorie. When she lived in South Georgia, the carpenter bees were very destructive. Are they pollinators?
Good question.
They are, yes. Yeah, it's always a fine line between something that's a real pain in the butt versus something that's advantageous. We think of the wasps as something we don't like, but at some level they're helpful too. So I would say if you're able to give them a sacrifice area, and then sometimes there's just ways, where you just might have to manage them too. Cause I know I put out my wasp hornet yellow jacket traps just to control those, cause I don't like them any more than anyone else.
Rebecca was saying in the chat, Rebecca was saying in the chat that she just uses hamburgers, so that would work too.
Yeah, lunch meat, hot dogs, it could be anything.
So what about those little tube nests? Are those, the little cutaway things that are Are those designed mostly for native bees or?
They are, and if you're going to purchase any or make any, I would make sure that the tubes are at least 8 inches long, if not longer, because the bees will fill from the back and work their way forward. And if it's too short, they don't like to go in those little spaces. So sometimes we can buy them and they're just the size of like a small envelope. So if you can make longer ones, and then the key is to try to clean it out every year. So if you notice that they've hatched, just stick something in there and try to clean it out so that those bees can reuse that space again.
And is there particular wood that is better or worse?
I would just do something that's not treated as natural as possible. You can also roll up, paper or even like paper grocery bags if you have those. So anything, I even grew, like last year I grew sunflowers, and then I had all the sunflower stalks, you could put some of those in there.
Nice.
Anything from your garden, yeah, you could repurpose into native pollinator habitat space.
The other thing that we're recommending, if you're in the Pacific Northwest, we're really recommending that you clean those out in the winter and wash off the bee cocoons, because we have some we have uninvasive fly parasitoid on specifically mason bees. We have a lot of other diseases and parasitoids that we're dealing with in those.
Good advice.
And just clean with water, or what do you clean with?
Usually a really mild bleach water, just as like a cap full of bleach and water will usually do the trick, and it doesn't harm the bees.
Excellent.
Would vinegar do the same thing?
Yeah, that would probably be okay.
Okay.
Just make sure it's pretty diluted.
Yeah. Awesome. Good to know.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, this was great,
Katie.
great presentation, and very timely. Perfect time of year to hear about this.
Exactly.
Yep. 'Tis the season.
Okay. Yep. Hey, Linz, thank you so much. That was amazing. I've been looking forward to that for a while. Lindsay's in high demand right now. So, anyway.